Journal continues.
We're back for our weekly Spotlight on Magazine segment, and today we have Nick Troiano, who is the Executive Director of Unite America, and we're going to talk about his article in the Atlantic magazine, Party Primaries Must Go. Nick, good morning.
Good to be with you, Jesse.
Okay, so first of all, tell our viewers what Unite America is and what Unite America does.
Sure. Unite America is an organization that's working to enact nonpartisan electoral and congressional reforms in order to foster a more functional and representative government so that we can actually solve the big challenges facing the country. And so we're building a cross-partisan philanthropic community to support that work. We're supporting organizations and campaigns that are doing the work, and we're also leading that work in several states.
Where exactly does Unite America get its funding? Who supports y'all?
Well, we disclose all of our donors on our website, and it is a community of philanthropists who understand that we need a functional government in order to solve any of the problems that we care about. Our donors may not agree on politics or policy, but they do agree that we need to have a healthy democracy. You know, the US government spends more than 20 times the amount of every charitable contribution on an annual basis in our country. And so there's a large return on investment in making sure government's functional if we want to solve the other issues that philanthropists care about.
So let's talk about your article in the Atlantic, Party Primaries Must Go. Tell us what you see as the primary problem in American politics.
Well, I sat down to write this piece in the aftermath of January 6th, and I see it, as many do, as a watershed moment in our country's history because there was a violent insurrection at the seat of our government in Washington, D.C. to disrupt the counting of the Electoral College votes. There is nothing more fundamentally American or important to our democracy than the peaceful transfer of power, and it was attacked that day. And I don't think we can go back to politics as usual after that. What was revealing was that hours before the insurrection, President Trump was on the National Mall, and what he said to his supporters was, we have to get our people to fight, and if they don't, we primary them. And so it was a demonstration of how partisan primaries have become weaponized by the political extremes on both sides and are pushing our politics to the edges. And so if there ever was a moment to respond in a way to fix our political system, I think it's now. And I think it's by abolishing partisan primaries. Because what we saw that day was 147 Republicans vote against or objected to the Electoral College vote for fear of the small amount of voters who will determine their reelection, not in the general election, but in the primaries. And so that's why we believe partisan primaries are a primary problem fueling division in our political system, and that they need reform.
Now, isn't getting rid of a partisan primary kicking political parties out of the election process of the members of their own party?
No. Our view is that elections ought to be serving the public, not the parties, although parties have an important role. They can nominate and endorse candidates. They can support those candidates in elections and develop policy ideas. None of that changes. But what does change is that our electoral system ought to be one where every vote is heard and every voice is heard. And so the problem with partisan primaries today, as the Unite America report found, is that in 83% of congressional districts, the actual election isn't the general election where most people vote. It's actually the primary, because those districts are so heavily Democratic or Republican. And in the primaries, turnout is very low. Some of that is because those elections don't get a lot of attention. Some of it is because the rules have excluded voters from it, including more than 10 million independent voters nationally. And furthermore, in the primaries, you don't even need to win a majority of the vote. You just need to win a plurality. And so the impact that that has is that what we found is that only 10% of eligible voters in America wound up determining 83% of congressional seats. And so the tail is wagging the dog in our politics. Partisan primaries disenfranchise voters, they distort our representation, and they're fueling division that is standing in the way of our ability to solve the problems that the country cares about.
You just identified two problems there, and I want to go back to each one at a time to see if we can talk more specifically about them. What do partisan primaries have to do with gerrymandering? Is one the result of the other? And the second thing you brought up there was voter turnout. We know we saw great voter turnout for the national elections. What was voter turnout like for the primaries, and is that a problem there as well?
So on your first question, gerrymandering is related to the primary problem in the sense that when politicians are choosing their own districts and drawing their own district lines, they're drawing them in a way to protect themselves. So to crack or pack districts so that the general elections aren't competitive. But the main reason why we have so many uncompetitive seats, that 83% number, is not because of gerrymandering. It's actually because of our own self-sorting geographically, with urban areas trending more Democratic, rural areas trending more Republican. So even if we were to solve gerrymandering, which we should, we would not solve the primary problem. That will persist. And so the way that we can solve for the fact that there are overwhelmingly red and blue districts is to ensure that all voters get to have a say in the elections, that the primary election isn't the only election that matters, but actually the general election is too. And that gets to the point of voter turnout. The fact is that most people are paying attention when November comes around, and we want to make sure that those elections actually have a say in influencing who gets elected. And so the solution that I'm sure we'll talk more about is what a nonpartisan primary system looks like.
Well, you brought up my very next question. What is your solution to elections if you get rid of partisan primaries? How would you then run elections?
Well, nonpartisan primaries will replace both parties' partisan primaries so that there will be a single ballot in which all candidates and all voters get to participate. And the top finishers go to the general election, which in our view should be the top 5. And in the general election, voters will have an option of ranking them according to preference so that whomever wins is ensured to have majority support through an instant runoff election. The advantage of this system for voters is they will have more choice and they will have a vote that counts. The advantage to our political system is that our leaders will be liberated from partisan primaries that threaten their election only among a small group of voters, say if they compromise on a piece of legislation. And furthermore, what I think the most powerful aspect of this system is that there are no lesser of two evil contests anymore of one Democrat versus one Republican, where it becomes a zero-sum binary black and white race to the bottom. When there are more than two candidates in the general election, candidates will have to campaign on their ideas, not just their identity, not just I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican and the other side is horrible, but here's what I stand for. And I think that can have a transformative impact on our politics.
So to make sure I understand what you're saying correctly, you would eliminate the Democratic Party primary, the Republican Party primary, the Independent or Green Party primaries, and you would make all of those candidates run for the same office at the same time in a primary, and then take the top vote getters and have them run in November. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's right. And this system is called Final 5 voting or Final 4 voting, which is what was adopted by Alaska this past November via ballot initiative. And the voters there embrace this system because they want to have more choice and voice in their elections and see greater competition. And the impact was evident already in the case of Senator Lisa Murkowski, who's up for re-election in 2022. After January 6th and the impeachment trial in which she voted to convict President Trump, they wanted to primary her, but that does not become possible anymore under this system. So it will reward rather than punish our leaders for acts of political courage. And that's not just on the Republican side, but the Democratic side as well. As we see going into the next year's elections, there's groups like Justice Democrats who are trying to source more progressive challengers to leaders who are putting country over party in Congress. And so this will have a positive and pragmatic effect on a political system that's by itself being torn apart.
Let me remind our viewers that they can take part in this conversation. We're going to open up our regular lines, which means Republicans call 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, Independents 202-748-8002. Keep in mind you can always text us at 202-748-8003, and we're always reading on social media, on Twitter at CSPAN WJ, and on Facebook at facebook.com/CSPAN. Now, Nick, without separate party primaries, one of our social media followers points out, with no primaries, the ballot would be as long as a larded up House bill. You would have a lot of people running for the same office on the same ballot. Wouldn't that give the advantage to candidates who have greater name recognition? Meaning if you're a TV star or you're already serving in the office, people know who you are and they can find you on the ballot. They don't know who the other people are. How do you get around the problem of just having great name recognition to get into an office?
I think the issue of ballot cluttering, which is what you brought up first, is a legitimate concern, but I don't anticipate it'll become one, because when you look at the primaries that already take place in 151 districts, our report found there was no competition in the dominant party primary in 2020. And so in those elections, essentially no voters had a say in who were being elected. So by combining the party primaries into a single nonpartisan primary, it'll actually incentivize more competition, but not an overwhelming amount. And the primaries will serve its public purpose, which is to take a wider field of candidates and narrow it to just a few choices for voters in the general election.
And you mentioned earlier that Alaska has recently adopted the nonpartisan primary. How many states use the nonpartisan primary for their elections, for Congress, for statewide office, for local offices?
Well, there are 4 states that use nonpartisan primaries for state or federal office, including Nebraska, California, Washington, and now Alaska. And in the first 3 states that I mentioned, they have what's called top 2 nonpartisan primary, where all the candidates run and the top 2 finishers go to the general election. And studies have shown that that is correlated with increased participation and competition in those elections, as well as having less extreme outcomes. What we think is an improvement on that system is actually advancing 4 or 5 candidates to the general election, so voters have even more choice. And this idea of final 5 voting was originally promoted by a board member of United America named Catherine Gale, who's the founder of the Institute for Political Innovation. And she and her co-author, Michael Porter, analyzed our political system as if it were an industry. And what they found was that the politics industry isn't serving its customers. In fact, this 2-party duopoly is largely serving itself and has rigged the rules to its own benefit. And so they concluded we need healthier competition, and a final 5 voting system can help us get there. It's of course not the only reform that is needed and won't solve everything overnight, but it will solve the primary problem. And as we've seen, it is a solution that is possible to enact. And now we're working to help spread that to other states.
In an earlier segment, we had a conversation about the Supreme Court, and we had some people say that, well, the Supreme Court's been the same way for a long time, why change it? And that also brings the question up, partisan primaries have been part of American politics for a long time. And I want to read a little bit from your article about your response to the question, well, it's been this way, why change it? And this is from the article, Party Primaries May Go. Partisan primaries may seem like a natural and immutable part of the American political system, but they are a relatively new phenomenon. For much of American history, party leaders would pick their party's candidates without any public participation at all. That changed in the progressive era when reformers sought to crack down on political corruption. Wisconsin became the first state to allow voters to directly nominate candidates for each party through primary elections in 1904. And within a decade, a majority of states were doing the same. Rather than empowering voters, direct primaries enshrined a role for political parties, which are private entities, in a publicly funded electoral process. And in doing so, the party bases became the new party bosses. So you point out here that partisan primaries have only been existing since 1904. Go ahead.
Yeah, we often take for granted that the system has been like this forever and can't be changed. But let's not forget that 100 years ago, following another period of dysfunction and division in our country's history, we made sweeping changes to the way that we held elections to give voters more choice and more power. Among those changes was taking the power of nominating candidates out of the hands of party bosses and putting it into the hands of the voters. Now, where that has gone wrong is that enshrined a role for these private organizations in our political process. But we can improve upon that. We've learned some lessons, and now we can continue our tradition in our country of continuing to innovate and improve the way that we elect. Because the bottom line is that Americans are dissatisfied with the representation that we're getting today or not getting today. Half of us now identify as politically independent. Nearly 2/3 would like to see a new party. 7 out of the 8 last elections were change elections, but we're not seeing much change. Things are getting worse. And that's because we're focusing on who we elect rather than how we elect, when it's the systems of our elections that shape the incentives that determine the behavior of our elected officials. So if we want different outcomes, we're going to have to change the way that we elect our leaders so that they have to build a broader coalition of support rather than just pandering to the base of their party. And we've done this in the past, and we can do so again.
Let's let some of our viewers take part in this conversation. Let's start with Randy, who lives in Pell City, Alabama, and calling in on the Democratic line. Randy, good morning.
Nah, I don't agree with changing that, and I think we ought to leave it like it's been. We get to pick who we want to go represent our party, and we don't need no 4, 5, 6 different people on there. If you don't vote in the primary, you don't get to vote in the general. And that's the way I feel about it, and I don't like that young man's idea of what he likes to do. Thank you.
Go ahead and respond there, Nick.
Thank you, Randy. Well, things won't change for voters in the sense that you will still be able to vote for your most preferred candidate in the primary, and you can still vote for your most preferred candidate in the general election. But it will change for voters who are disenfranchised by the current system. If you're an independent, where I'm from in Pennsylvania, you can't vote in the primary, even if that's the only election that matters in your district. Why should you have to be coerced in it to affiliate with a political party in order to have a voice in who represents you? That's not right. And so this system will bring more voices into the process and, importantly, lead to better outcomes as a result. Because no longer is it 10% of voters who our leaders have to worry about pandering to for fear of getting a primary challenger. They'll be incented to represent all of the people. And the impact of that is that they can actually work together to solve problems, because we will reward and rather than punish that kind of legislative behavior that we see much not enough of today.
Now, one of our social media followers wants to know, has a question for you as well. They want to know, why aren't you pushing for public funded elections? It would eliminate special interest funding and expand the possibility of a less well-funded candidate to run for elected office. Is a publicly funded election something that would stop an open primary?
It wouldn't stop an open primary, no. And as I mentioned before, there are many changes that we need to our political system. And that's why we're building support for nonpartisan election reform at both a state and federal level. And in fact, the Ballot initiative that adopted Final Four voting in Alaska also prohibited dark money in their elections. There's more transparency as a result. And so these ideas, I think, can happen together. There is a movement around all the different reforms that we need to fix our politics, and campaign finance certainly is among them.
Let's talk to Rick, who's calling from Homestead, Florida, on the Republican line. Rick, good morning.
Hello. I just want to say that this is ridiculous. I'm a proud Republican, and I don't want some willy-nilly rhino representing my brand and my party. And this is where we get to choose. We get to choose our values. We get to choose our beliefs. In the primary, put up a strong candidate. The Socialist Democrats can put up their candidate, and then we go. And whoever wins, wins. And this placating, this disenfranchised mumbo jumbo. Hey, people got to toughen up, Buttercup. Get in there, fight the fight, and whoever wins wins. And enough of this pandering, willy-nilly stuff.
Go ahead and respond there, Nick.
Yeah, I would say that the nonpartisan primary was challenged in the Supreme Court, and it was Clarence Thomas who wrote that the First Amendment doesn't guarantee political parties the right to nominate and name their candidate on a primary ballot. A very conservative Supreme Court justice, of course. Parties can still have a role. They can still recruit and endorse a candidate in this process and through whatever process they want, whether that's a private convention or you name it. And so Randy can still participate in that process. But for the rest of us who want to elect a representative, not just a Republican or a Democratic leader, this system will serve the country better. And that's really what the goal is. How do we have a political system that narrows our differences in order to produce outcomes in the public interest rather than exaggerates them because we're fighting on two teams, Team Red and Team Blue? We have to remember that when our Constitution was written and our government was created, there was no mention of political parties. In fact, our founders feared the rise of factions and the alternate domination of one against another, as Washington warned. This system returns us to the roots of what Republican government, small r, is supposed to look like in electing leaders who will put the public interest over partisan and special interests.
Now, in the current partisan primary process, the parties run the primary. In a nonpartisan primary process, who runs the primaries? Is it the state? Is it the cities? Is it the federal government? Who runs primaries?
Well, right now, it's the state/the government that runs partisan primaries. So publicly funded elections are now being used to run primaries for these private organizations. And that's what we're aiming to fix, because that system isn't serving the voters very well. And under a nonpartisan primary, it'll remain the case that the state will run these primaries and determine the rules and so forth.
Let's go back to our phone lines and talk to Jenkins, who's calling from Ellenwood, Georgia, on the Democratic line. Jenkins, good morning.
Yes, voting and acknowledge. Here in Georgia, if some of these districts were not created like a kidney, there would be very little participation by the blacks, because the Caucasian would carve it out and dilute the power of the black vote. How would you address that?
Well, I think one of the benefits of the nonpartisan primary with ranked choice voting is that it will lead to better representation, including for minority candidates, because right now in our system of elections, votes can get split between many candidates in a field. And so that is a blocker for getting a more diverse candidate pool and for electing a more diverse set of legislators. If we're able to rank our candidates and use ranked choice voting, we'll prevent the kind of vote splitting that leads to that outcome. And I think we'll see more diverse candidates run and get elected as well.
You've talked about the states that already have the nonpartisan primaries. Are there states that are thinking about it for upcoming elections this year or in 2022?
There are. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a bipartisan group of about 20 legislators in Wisconsin that introduced a bill for Final Five voting. And there are other states now that are considering ballot initiatives for this reform in 2022. And so there's a groundswell, and I think it helps when people can see these reforms actually get enacted elsewhere and actually make a difference. Back when we first established party primaries a century ago, Wisconsin was the first state in 1904. Within a decade, a majority of states adopted it. Wouldn't it be great if within this decade, a majority of states adopted reforms, including nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting, and ended gerrymandering and increased access to the ballot in a secure way for voters? This could be a new decade of democracy reform in our country, which is sorely needed when you look at the state of polarization and division that's threatening not only good governance, but democracy itself.
Talk a little bit about what's going on in Georgia, because right now, Georgia's new voting law says this, and I'm going to read this for our viewers. The Georgia law will require a ranked choice ballot to be sent to military and overseas voters in primaries and general elections, along with a standard ballot. The ranked choice ballot will be counted in event of a runoff. Talk about what's going on in Georgia right now with that.
Yeah, there are many states, now Georgia, that already use ranked choice voting for overseas and military voters. Because if you think about it, in states that require a candidate to win over 50% and therefore have runoff elections, if you're living overseas, you don't have the ability to get your ballot and return it in time to participate in the runoff. And so ranked choice voting is used. So when you get your ballot, you can rank your candidates according to preference. And if your preferred candidate is not the person who gets 50% plus one, then your second preference will count rather than having to go back to the polls. And so it's an interesting use case about why ranked choice voting is a better, cheaper, faster way to hold an election. And what we'd like to see is it not only be used for overseas and military voters, but all voters ought to have that option. In last year's presidential election, for example, there were hundreds of thousands of voters who cast ballots for candidates who subsequently dropped out of the race before Election Day. Had they had the opportunity to rank their second or third preference, their voice would have mattered. And that's another advantage of a ranked choice voting system.
Now, with a ranked choice voting system, would that eliminate the need for any runoff in any election?
It would, and that's why it's otherwise called an instant runoff. Voters don't have to come back to the polls in order to select a candidate. And the benefit is that the person who wins will have majority support. We want to have leaders and elected officials who have broad support across the electorate, not just from a sliver. And what we saw in the primaries, for example, last year was that in many open seats where you can have 5, 6, 7 candidates, in about a quarter of them, we had winners who did not get majority support. One example of that is in Georgia with Marjorie Taylor Greene. She won with about 40% of the vote in an election in which only 14% of eligible voters in that district participated. And so we get people elected to office, and once they're there, they're going to stay there, who actually get there with just a sliver of support. That was the same case in 2018 with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who won with just 5% of eligible voters in her district. The point of these reforms is to ensure not only more voices are heard, but that those who win have broadest support among all the people.
Let's go back to our phone lines and let's talk to Lynn, who's calling from Mount Vernon, New York, on the Democratic line. Lynn, good morning.
Good morning. So I think it's a wonderful idea, and I think people would remain ignorant rather than incorporate new change. This would allow people to vote for their interests more than their party.
Go ahead and respond there, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. That's exactly right. It is a reform that gives voters more power to have greater say in their elections and find someone who actually represents them. One advantage as well is that it levels the playing field for new competition. In our current system, because of the vote splitting that could happen, you've probably been in the situation where you'd like to vote for an independent or third-party candidate, but you fear that voting for them would take away a vote from your second preferred candidate and wind up electing your least preferred. This system would do away with that. And so it would allow people to actually cast ballots for those whom they actually prefer. And so we might see better people and different people run for office. And that's a good thing in a democracy like we have, which right now is, very gridlocked between the existing choices we have.
One of our social media followers has a scenario they want you to address. They say, without party primaries, you will have shenanigans. You will have Republicans voting for weak Democratic candidates that they know will be beatable in the general and vice versa. You want to vote in the primary, pick a side and join them. You can always change back. So they see voters getting together and picking weaker candidates in an open primary to face in a Final Four, Final Two, Final Five runoff on Election Day. How would this be resolved?
I would say the system is more susceptible to that currently than under a Final Five system. And to the extent that it is, we don't see much of it in the states that have open primaries, for example. How the system is currently being gamed is by very small, narrow interest groups that, because so few voters are participating in these primaries, they can raise and spend a modest sum of money and actually have great influence in those elections because not a lot of people are participating or paying attention. So the current system is being gamed by those who are profiting from division, those who raise money off of it and get votes and drive ratings. The point is, we're being played by the current game. If we want to change the outcome, we have to change the rules of the game. And that's what these reforms can help us do.
Let's talk to Joe, who's calling from Staten Island, New York, on the Republican line. Joe, good morning.
Yeah, I disagree. I keep the Zoom magazine, but keep reading the partisan primaries. I like the primaries. Pay attention. Cuomo, he has troubles, but he signed the bill to make it easier to re-register as a Democrat, Republican, or Green, Libertarian after the election. And the problem is that it's too hard to get third parties on the ballot. There's barrier entry. Too many signatures to get on the ballot in the first place. Only Democrat, Republican, that's the problem. Keep the primaries. Thank you.
I think the caller raises other good points about how the system is broken, that the barrier to entry for new competition is so high, because that's one of the things both parties actually agree on, which is to make it difficult for any new competition. I faced that when I ran as an independent candidate for Congress back in 2014. And not only do other candidates have a harder time getting on the ballot, but also we have something called sore loser laws in 47 states in our country, where if you're running as part of a major party and you lose your primary, the state actually prohibits you from the ability to get on the general election ballot. So examples of states where they don't have that was in Connecticut, for example, where Senator Lieberman lost his primary but was able to get on the general election ballot and wound up winning. States that have this rule, for example, include Delaware, where back in 2010, Mike Castle lost his primary and was unable to get on the general election ballot. And the other candidate wound up winning. And so these rules that are in the system that are sort of behind the curtain are meant to maintain the power of the current political establishment and keep out those who would try to disrupt it and disrupt a system that's not working. And that goes back to the point that if we want to change the outcomes, we have to change the rules. And we can do so in a way where we can work together and transcend the current divisions to advance these goals, even if we don't happen to agree on particular candidates or particular policy. I think we can all agree that we want a system that represents us.
Now, there was an argument against nonpartisan primaries in the Huffington Post, and I want to read you a couple of paragraphs and have you address the concerns that they bring up against nonpartisan primaries. Why should anybody who isn't part of a political party have any voice in deciding who will be the leaders to represent that party in the contest for political office? If someone doesn't want to affiliate, then they can participate in the general election, which is open to all registered voters, then choose among the options provided by the parties. That is, they get to choose among the candidates put forward by those citizens who, unlike them, have come together to achieve some common goals through the organization of their political party. I am not a member of the Rotary Club, the Kiwanis, the Rotarians, or Lions, or any other organization of that kind, and I would not claim any right to tell them who their leaders should be. Why should a Democrat or independent have a right to tell Republicans, for example, who have formed a party, who their leaders should be? What would be your response to that?
We should have a Congress of 535 Americans, people who are representing all of the people in their states and districts, not just their own party. Parties have an important role to play. Folks like that writer can still participate in a party organization to support or endorse their own candidate. But for the rest of us, for the rest of voters, we should all have a say. And as I said before, in 83% of congressional districts, the election has already occurred by November. So you can cast a ballot in the general election. But in most places, that decision was already made sort of months prior. And listen, no election system is perfect, but we have to realize the flaws of today's election system. Do you like the outcomes that we're getting in Washington right now on any issue? If not, we ought to be open-minded to what changes we'd like to see. And I'd offer immigration as one such issue, because we've seen how it is now again on the political agenda. It's a perennial issue, but it hasn't yet been solved because of how the system has been designed and pushes people to the extremes. Back in 2013, the Senate passed a bipartisan bill, but it wasn't even brought for a vote in the House because Speaker Boehner at the time knew that he couldn't get a majority of Republicans in his own caucus to vote for it because they feared what would happen in their primaries, and for good reason. Eric Cantor was primaried and defeated in his next election, largely because of his stance on immigration. And it was an issue in 2013 because Democrats didn't address it when they had full power in 2009, 2010. Some would say because some issues are worth more unsolved to continue to rally their base and actually solving it. And so immigration is an example where 74% of Americans, for example, agree that there ought to be a path to legal status for the 4 million dreamers who were brought to our country. And yet we continue to have no solution. There is a human price to pay for that. There's an economic price to pay for it, but there's no political price. And that's the problem. If our political system actually rewarded problem solving and the Americans agreed on issues for 74%, you can bet it would have been done by now. But because of the way the system has been engineered, we won't be able to solve immigration or name your other issue, the national debt on healthcare, for example. These things are not going to get unstuck until we fix the system.
Let's go back to our phone lines and talk to Bob, who's calling from Raleigh, North Carolina on the Democratic line. Bob, good morning.
Good morning. Nick, in the Democratic primary, Kamala Harris got less than 1% of the vote, and she could very easily end up being president of the United States. And I don't think there can be any major reform without campaign finance reform. Thank you.
I would say what's true on the Republican side as well is that President Trump got less than 50% of votes in the Republican primary in 2016 as well. Another case of a wide candidate field and vote splitting leading to just a plurality rather than a majority winner. So if we want to have leaders on both sides that represent a broader section of the electorate, we need to get rid of plurality voting and move to majority voting and systems like ranked choice.
Let's go to Gene, who's calling from Alabama on the Republican line. Gene, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. Thank you for taking my call. I disagree with your guest. My daughter moved from Illinois to California and voted in the primary as a Republican. When the results came out, there were nothing but 2 Democrats that had won. And there was no option for a Republican to vote in the general election. And to make things worse, what happened then is the Democrats have the 2 leading candidates, and then they go to Washington and they vote as a solid block for the Democrat Party. So we have no say-so as Republicans in the state of California. Thank you.
I'd say the caller raises a good point, because in that district, likely, as many others in California, if it's a very blue district, it's going to elect a Democrat no matter what. And so what the nonpartisan primary allows is for voters to say, well, do you like this flavor of Democrat or this flavor? And one may be more progressive and one may be more moderate. Who's a better fit for this district? Now, the advantage of a top 4 or top 5 system is that if you don't want to weigh in on the likely party candidate who will win, you can still vote for the candidate from your own party. And that's why we are supporting a system that advances a few more candidates to the general election. But it goes back to the point around how most districts are solidly blue or red, and most voters today don't have a say in ultimately the candidate that winds up being elected.
Let's talk to Ed, who's calling from Cincinnati, Ohio, on the independent line. Ed, good morning.
Good morning. I'm just calling to all of these people call in to complain about how the voting system goes. I have been voting for something like 62 years, and I'm not a party voter. I vote for the person that I think that does the job the way he's supposed to do. If all these other people would get away from being a party voter, a party voter sucks.
I think we lost Ed there, but go ahead and respond to what he said.
I think we'll have a healthier politics if more voters have the opportunity to vote for the best candidate and not just against the party they really don't like in the general election. And that's one of the goals of this reform, I would say.
Let's talk to Barbara, who's calling from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, on the Democratic line. Barbara, good morning.
Good morning. That's Cape Girardeau.
Girardeau, go ahead.
So I agree with the Huffington Post. In my opinion, this guy just wants to eliminate parties, political parties. He wants to take the power away from the people who join a party.
Do you agree there, Nick? Do you just want to get rid of political parties?
No, I think parties play an important role, and they should play a proper role. And our election system ultimately should serve the voters, not the parties. The parties can play a role in the election system. I think that's consistent with the original design of our constitutional framework and what will lead to better outcomes for the country. The report that we released called The Primary Problem, co-written with my colleagues Tyler Fisher and Beth Laddick, will, if you go to uniteamerica.org and read it, you'll see just how pernicious this system is in giving more extreme outcomes and where our country is at. There's 2/3 of us who consider ourselves to be in the, quote, exhausted majority. Most of us aren't on the extremes. How is it that we keep getting a Congress, though, where most members are elected on the fringes, where their approval rating is under 20%, yet more than 90% of them get reelected? That disconnect is because there is an incongruity between what it takes to govern and what it takes to get reelected. And the current system perpetuates that flaw. And I think we need to fix it if we care about actually getting to problem solving more than we care about what team happens to be in power.
A real quick question we'll wrap up on. We've talked a lot about Congress, statewide and local elections. Are you pushing for nonpartisan primaries for presidential elections?
These reforms would also impact all federal offices. I don't believe the presidential election. I think those will remain for the parties to each put forward a candidate.
Do you think we should have a nonpartisan primary and ranked choice for a presidential election?
I certainly think we should have ranked choice voting general elections. I think many voters are familiar with, Ralph Nader from 2000 or Gary Johnson and Jill Stein from the 2016 election. Many voters desire to vote for not a Democrat or Republican, and many voters fear of the role that these third candidates can play. It will serve all voters if we're able to prevent vote splitting and ensure a majority winner, which ranked choice voting would do in the presidential election. You may remember in 2020, for example, Howard Schultz explored running as an independent and ultimately did not. And the spoiler effect, this vote splitting, was a main reason why that potential candidacy didn't get enough air. And we should be a country and a political system that embraces new entrants and new competition and new ideas. The current rules don't allow it, and that's yet another reason why we should change it.
Well, we'd like to thank Nick Troiano, Executive Director of Unite America, for being with us this morning and talking about his article, Party Primaries Must Go. Nick, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And we'd like to thank all of our guests, our callers, and our viewers for another edition of Washington Journal. Continue to wash your hands and stay safe. Have a great Saturday, everyone.